One of my brothers was very small when he was born, and there was some concern about whether he would survive. He did survive, but he was smaller than most people in our family, and my grandparents gave him the nickname Punk. They intended it as a term of affection, but he never heard it as such. He hated the nickname, and if you wanted to get into a fight with him, you only needed to call him Punk, which I quickly learned not to do, except when trying to provoke him. My grandparents were the only people who could call him Punk, and everyone else generally was afraid to even utter the word around him. It's my impression that we have a word in our culture which creates a similar response in most people. A word that no one wants to be called, and if called this word, it typically leads to quite a fight. I call this word the new Scarlet letter. I'm not sure if they still require high school students to read Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, and to be honest, it's doubtful that I read it in high school, even though it was one of my assignments. But I didn't need to read it to learn about the basic plot and what the letter A denoted in the story. The new Scarlet Letter is R, and it stands for racism. I preached a sermon on racism 4 years ago after the shootings at Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, when the bishops of that denomination asked all churches to focus on this subject matter the first Sunday in September of that year. One of the points I was attempting to make was that we all struggle with racism, both knowingly and unknowingly, or consciously and unconsciously. And I encourage people to be willing to listen and not react with defensive postures that deny or dismiss perceptions of racism. Now, in all truthfulness, I think people struggled with that suggestion, and I perceive that things have only gotten more tense in the last 4 years. Both Donald Trump and Joe Biden have used the very same words when responding to questions about racism, saying, "There's not a racist bone in my body." My impression is that racism is much deeper than our bones. And I would cite the work of Stanford neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky, who in his book entitled Behave, describes subliminal and unconscious cueing. He relates a hugely unsettling sensory cue concerns race. Our brains are incredibly attuned to skin color. Flash a face for less than a tenth of a second, 100 milliseconds, so short a time that people aren't even sure they've seen something. Have them guess the race of the pictured face, and there's a better than even chance of accuracy. We may claim to judge someone by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, but our brains sure note color real fast. He goes on to relate, by 100 milliseconds, brain functions already differ in two depressing ways, depending on the race of the face, as shown in neuroimaging. First, in a widely replicated finding, the amygdala activates. Second, Subliminal signaling of race also affects the fusiform face area, the cortical region that specializes in facial recognition. It's to suggest that racism is deeply embedded in us and influences us in ways that we're not aware. Bishop Willimon cites science writer David Rock, who puts it a little more simply, but I knew that you would want the more technical version first. Rock describes how evolution hardwired our brains to be cautious and on guard against perceived enemies, which made sense in a time when our survival was threatened daily. When we heard a rustle in the bushes, our limbic system enabled us to quickly move into high alert mode. Today, these once valuable coping mechanisms are the source of some of our most damaging mistakes of judgment about others. Thousands of years of safely huddling in our tribes hardwired us to regard strangers as foes until proven otherwise. A recognition that racism is deeply embedded in brain functions that are somewhat like automatic brain functions. For instance, like breathing. Most of us aren't consciously thinking about how we need to breathe. We're just doing it. Can, I think, invite us to be more open to addressing this matter? Bishop Willimon helpfully shares an important revelation for me is that, yes, in spite of my denials, I'm racist. I don't believe I've ever knowingly committed an outright racist action. I wouldn't think of such a thing. But then that's often the problem with sin. It's mostly unconscious. Sin, the church has historically said, isn't so much the actions we commit that we know to be wrong, but rather sin is an innate human inclination over which we have little conscious control. So in a sermon series that we're calling Mixed Bag, and thinking about the complexities of who we are and how we live, I'm hopeful that I can convince you that a recognition and acknowledgement of racism gives us the capacity to move forward in ways that honor and serve the God who made us, and more importantly, is determined to redeem us all. This God is reflected in our scripture reading this morning, which is a part of John's vision of heaven in the 7th chapter of the book of Revelation, where he tells us, I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, every tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb. I never really took note of this text until after I had returned to Messiah a few years ago. And I thought to myself that we have great possibilities of reflecting this scripture passage in our life together, given the diversity of Northern Virginia. Of course, given what I've said about racism, it is no easy undertaking. But as my Haitian pastor friend taught me, do something so big that it cannot succeed unless God is in it. As we consider the vision of our scripture reading and the reality of the new Scarlet letter, I want to suggest that it will be helpful to admit our racism in an emotionally intelligent way. What I mean is that we typically respond with a sense of shame or defensiveness, rather than viewing it as a part of the human condition. which Christian faith can help us to acknowledge and believe with the grace of God, not be held captive by it. Like all sin, it will be challenging and demanding and require a sense of humility and a willingness to be uncomfortable. In saying this, I am assuming that you are not intentionally wanting to be a racist. If that should be the case, there's a whole different sermon for that subject matter, and you'll need to let me know that I need to preach about that on some other occasion. It may be that it is easier for me to acknowledge my racism because it's an undeniable fact that I was taught overt, explicit racism when I was just a little boy. And my favorite uncle, who drove a Lance delivery truck, we passed an African-American man who was walking on the side of the road. And he told me about how that man and people like him weren't really human beings. I'm not going to tell you what he said, because it was clearly racist. And I distinctly remember thinking to myself, why is he telling me this? And does he really think it's true? The things he had said were reinforced in more subtle ways by the language that other members of my family would use about people of different races. And I was taught on many occasions that I was better than those people. There were also unintentional ways that I was taught racism, which I don't think those who were teaching it even knew. For instance, while cleaning out my parents' home, I found a letter that my oldest brother had written me in the mid-1960s and had addressed it to Master Reginald Tuck. I never really understood the title of master for kids when I was a kid. But in recent years, I've read how it was a legacy from slavery when white children would be addressed as master as a way of socializing them into a hierarchy of race. In recent years, I read a book entitled True Vine, which concerned two albino brothers who grew up in the area where I did and were exploited by the circus. There were photographs of Ku Klux Klan parades in downtown Roanoke, and I learned that Roanoke had one of the largest Klan groups in the state of Virginia. They even had women's auxiliaries. All of that came as a surprise to me. And I think it likely shaped me in ways that I was not aware of. One of the most compelling confrontations with my own white privilege came when I was teaching at VCU. I was walking down the street before class, and an African-American man approached me and asked me for money. When I asked him why he needed money, he said he was hungry. I told him that we would go to Burger King and get some food. After we sat down and started eating our food, I engaged him in some small talk, asking him where he was from. He said that he had grown up in the Farmville area, and as the conversation progressed, it was clear to me that he was struggling with some mental health issues. I asked him how old he was. And it turned out that we were the same age, even though he looked older, no doubt a consequence of living on the streets. Finally, I thought to ask him his name. And he said his name was Reggie. Now, when the Reggie who's standing before you this morning was in elementary and middle school, The Reggie I was eating with that day could not go to school because in Prince Edward County, when I was a kid, they closed all the public schools rather than integrate the schools. We were exactly the same with one difference. And I contemplated how my life could have turned out very differently. Another instance came when I took a confirmation class from Blacksburg to Harlem one Sunday morning. We entered an African Methodist Episcopal church, and we were greeted by some older women, one of whom politely told me that we could go up to the balcony. After directing the group up there, I noticed that there was no one else in the balcony, and that the balcony was in a state of great disrepair. I also noted that there were lots of seats on the main floor available. And I assumed that the people must be in Sunday school and that they would fill those seats. When the choir appeared, and it was evident that there were plenty of seats on the main floor, I recognized the sweet little old ladies were trying to teach us a lesson. The African Methodist Episcopal Church formed when Richard Allen and other African Americans were told by the people of St. George's Methodist to go to the balcony, that they were no longer permitted on the main floor. The kids and the adults I had with me that day thought it was great that they got to sit in the balcony and never put together what was happening, even though we had visited St. George's Methodist Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church the day before in Philadelphia. I later told an African American congregation after recounting the story that if you want to teach people a lesson, you need to be certain they're going to get it. Neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky, who, by the way, describes himself as an atheist, it's not all doom and gloom when it comes to brain function and things like racism. He talks about brain plasticity and suggests that we can lessen the impact of such realities with awareness and intentionality. He uses religious examples like the response of family members to those murdered at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston and John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace. So once again, I want to suggest that we be open to conversation and dialogue and do our best not to get overly defensive when there are allegations of racism. When I was in Cuba, I thought I perceived less racism, and I asked about it. Oh, yes, they told me, there was no racism in Cuba. I asked how that had happened. They said because Castro had said there would be no racism. End of discussion. When I got back home and read up on the matter, I learned that racism, as studied by Cuban sociologists, is just as problematic in that society as our own. The difference is that the dictator would not allow anyone to talk about it. And while such conversations can be uncomfortable, at least we have the freedom to talk about it. And it's a good thing that we're talking about it. If you haven't seen the movie The Best of Enemies, I recommend it with the qualification that the book is even better. It's about Ann Atwater, who was an African-American domestic worker who became a leader in the civil rights movement, and C.P. Ellis, who was the exalted Cyclops of the Ku Klux Klan in Durham, North Carolina. They were forced to work together during the integration of public schools in 1971. Now, some of us were around in 1971, but I didn't know the story until this year. In the book, Osha Davidson tells how these unlikely enemies found something in common when they engaged in the difficult conversation. She writes, CP was particularly interested in the comments of a small, wiry black woman who charged that the teachers and the school administration treated her children as if they were stupid troublemakers just because they were poor and black. The woman's complaint caught CP's attention because he had been about to say the same thing about his children. They were treated badly because they were poor white trash. Even more amazing, this experience happened to him repeatedly throughout the day. For the first time in his life, CP really listened to black people and was stunned to hear over and over his own concerns coming from their mouths. Davison goes on to recount a conversation between Atwater and Ellis at the end of that day. "How are your kids?" CP asked Ann. "You got two, don't you?" "Yeah, but my youngest ain't doing too good," Ann said. "She comes home from school every day crying." "Why?" Ann regarded him carefully before answering. "Don't take this personal, CP, but her teacher's been saying that her mama's a fool to be working with a Klansman. Other kids have been fighting her over it." CP stared at Ann open-mouthed. "That's what's happening to my kids. But they're teased about their daddy selling out." Then Davison describes what happened next. And suddenly, he was crying. The tears came without warning, and once started, he was unable to stop them. Ann was dumbfounded, but she reacted instinctively by reaching out and taking his hand in her own. She tried to comfort him, stroking his hand and murmuring, "It's okay, it's okay," as he sobbed. Then she too began to cry. If anyone had walked into the auditorium just then, they would have found it hard to believe what they saw. The exalted Cyclops of the Ku Klux Klan and Durham's most militant black leaders sitting together, hand in hand, weeping copiously and oblivious to the world around them.